So thank you so much. My name's Jennifer Roberts. I'm Senior Education Officer with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and I'm based in the headquarters. We have part of our headquarters here in Copenhagen, and I'm with the education team. So my focus is not so much on the Nordic countries. My area is more on sudden and mass displacements. But prior to this, I also worked in Turkey and was involved in some adult language learning programs for refugees. So while our strategy does often focus on children, we do also have programs for adults. And I'll also say you can hear from my accent, I'm from South Africa with 11 official languages. I'm here in Denmark, and all I've learned to say is tak for mal. And that's about the limit of my Danish. So I can, maybe I also have something to learn about informal learning. Thank you. You have the clicker. So
it should work. Otherwise, you nod at me and I will.
Okay.
That's the arrows. Does it work?
No. No. So I'll nod it to you. So thanks. Super. As was mentioned, we speak a lot about refugees, and as our colleague from UNESCO was saying, we need to remember that forced displacement, and this is not just migration as a whole, but very specifically forced displacement is at an all-time high. And the figures from 2021 were that there were 84 million migrants. Not migrants, but forcibly displaced persons. And of these, 20.6 million are refugees. So the remaining number are internally displaced persons. And yesterday, a new report was issued on the state of internal displacement in the world. But in 2022, we've seen that number grow dramatically, with over 7.5 million internally displaced in Ukraine and 6.3 million displaced beyond the borders of Ukraine. And I wrote the slide 2 days ago, and I had to update the figures this morning, so that number is increasing. And the High Commissioner for Refugees is saying that we are on the path this year to see over 100 million displaced persons. And this is a phenomenal number. I mean, already that number of displaced persons, if we just look at the number of refugees, it is more than the populations of most of the Nordic countries. 85% of refugees are based in developing countries, and most stay very close to their countries of origin. And this is something that we typically see. But I just wanted to highlight this idea of the shades of meaning. We have a very strong legal definition of what is a refugee, of being somebody fleeing persecution, who has fled the borders of their country, who is unable or unwilling to seek protection from their own state. And people fleeing war. So it's both individual persecution, but also war and conflict. And when we talk about refugees, particularly, and this is particularly relevant when we talk about language learning and people's individual motivations for learning, that this term refugee covers a variety of conditions or states of being. So we have the person who is recently displaced. So if we think of those who have recently fled Ukraine, very often if we think of this in terms of what that means for language learning, people are very unwilling at the beginning of displacement to consider or to accept how long that could be for. And so what we see in almost every refugee crisis, people assume that they will be displaced for 6 months and that the conflict or the crisis will have abated. However, what we know is that most conflicts are now and refugee situations are protracted, which means that people are displaced for more than 5 years. So 85% of refugee situations are protracted. Sorry, not yet. And so, but that affects the attitudes and motivations and the willingness to invest in language learning and some of that emotional denial about wanting to invest in the language. Then we have those who are refugees for longer periods, who are in protracted situations, but also people who have moved to a country and are wanting to stay there and be there. So this is something that we saw with the migrant crisis or refugee crisis, which was a mixed movement in 2015, that people were moving to countries, and these were third or fourth countries that they had been in, but they were moving to the countries in which they wanted to then stay and invest. Whereas, let us say, an Afghan refugee who had been in Turkey may have always had an intention to actually seek protection somewhere else. Then the third category there is a resettled refugee. So somebody who has been through a formal process of being allocated and settling in a third state. So they will be often assessed in the country of arrival, and then only 1% of all refugees actually are resettled. And this is somebody then who is then would be looking to invest in being in that country. So all of these affect language learning, but we often have the tendency to just use the term refugee in a very broad sense, and it masks some of these issues that may then affect language learning. Thanks. So what we see in terms of language learning, and I am from the education section, we tend to focus mostly on children and youth, but refugees are caught between the past and their attachments to their country of origin, their home language, the maintenance of their language, the culture that's associated with it, the present of the country that they find themselves in, and then a future, and often a very uncertain or unknown future that's either framed around either remaining in a country, return, or moving to a third country, or even moving between countries, and what writers like Sarah Dryden Peterson are referring to in their work as transnationalism, that people are seeing themselves as being on the move, but intentionally and for economic purposes, even if they began as refugees. So I just want us to reflect a bit, and I mean, as language teachers, all of this will be familiar to you, about the impact of what it means for a refugee not speaking the language of the country that they're in. It really heightens both social exclusion, but also exclusion from services and the inability to be able to access key services, including healthcare. If you don't know how to, and I have even seen it in my own life in Turkey, just an unwillingness to want to engage with some administrative processes. And so you avoid going to the doctor or going to a clinic because it's just too difficult. And on top of some of the trauma and the emotional issues associated with being forced to flee, the emotional work of engaging can be too great. But also the emotional and psychological senses of being helpless and being isolated, and just being maybe having gone from being a professional person, being a lawyer or a doctor in the country where you are, to not being able to do anything and having to rely on people for everything. When I worked in Turkey, I was in Ankara. There were very few people outside of our office who spoke English. I had to ask my colleagues to do simple tasks like making an appointment at the beautician, and then having to ask my colleague, this is what I need done at the beautician. And it's an infantilizing process where you become so dependent. And I was lucky and unfortunate, but when you are a refugee, you are placed in that position constantly and every day, in addition to other issues. We also have issues of safety. And for example, women in experiencing domestic abuse may fear or be unable to report to the authorities their experiences. And this may not be so severe in Nordic countries, but this may hold true in other situations. But also xenophobia, that as you speak and as you open your mouth and go around your business, you can be exposed to xenophobia. I mentioned I'm from South Africa, and we've had a wave of xenophobic violence against refugees and other persons from Africa. And because we have languages with clicks in, people will be asked, who look foreign, will be asked to say the word, or to say a word for something. So, for example, a name of a city is Ngonga. And so if people can't pronounce it correctly, they've been attacked, they've been exposed to violence. So language then actually opens you to the risk of violence. Thanks. And so this is just a quote from a Syrian refugee in Turkey about what it meant to him after he'd gone through a language course that was offered in a non-formal learning center, but supported by the Turkish Ministry of Education. And just that sense of personal empowerment. And of course, then we heard about motivation and brain plasticity, but it's then that you lower the effective barriers to learning and be able to engage in those informal and non-formal processes. I also just wanted to mention these two terms, inclusion and integration. And sort of within the work that UNHCR does and the way that we write about these issues, inclusion is often referred to in a structural sense. So inclusion in services, inclusion in schools, in healthcare systems, in social welfare programs. And it tends to be more of a structural relationship, more of a horizontal relationship between the individual and the state. But again, without language, you cannot engage in that. You cannot be able to interface with those services. Whereas integration is more relational, it's horizontal, it's about the social aspects, and it's the ability that even if you are in a school or in a hospital or engaging in different processes, if you cannot communicate, you do not have those effective abilities to be able to learn. Thanks. I just, because I'm from the education section, I do speak about education and educational access. This is about primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And you'll see that although refugees have there's been large improvements in access to primary education, that drops off very significantly at secondary level. These are the global figures. We don't have it disaggregated around the Nordic countries. And in fact, we don't have this kind of data for countries in Europe, because when people enroll in schools, they are not, under the GDPR, they are not labeled or recorded as being either refugees or migrants. So these are global figures. But what it means is that as people move from country to country, and do not speak the language, that ability to proceed to higher levels of education is often not possible as the content and the language use in education becomes more abstract. And it's also important to consider the issues of trauma and people's own emotional states and how that impacts their language use. Thanks. So just to sum up with some recommendations, and because language is so intimately tied with daily life, with also with identity, but what we really recommend, both in a social setting but also in educational settings, is an additive approach, and one that respects the identity, the culture, and where possible is able to maintain the language that people are coming to the country with. And we see this discussion happening very live at the moment for those of you following the Ukraine crisis, and education for those who fled Ukraine. The Ministry of Education in Ukraine is also advocating that even if children go to a Danish or a Swedish school, that they have the opportunity to do Ukrainian language classes after school. But we need to affirm people's dignity. And this has been one of the issues that we have seen, that where people are not able to speak their languages, even in schools or education institutions, there's that sense of being not good enough. That why is my language good enough at being at home? Why is it not good enough for being in school or in other settings? And so it's really important to sort of look at how do we actually promote that multilingualism. But offering the different language learning routes, it's important to sort of see how different processes can work simultaneously, and often that blend between formal, non-formal, and informal learning. And actually people being given the access and the the information and the tools and the encouragement to use those multiple intersecting routes to learn language. And I mean, I know there could be informal ways I could have learned Danish and learned more than takformal, but I haven't. And I would consider myself somebody who has access to information. So we need to think about how to really encourage that. But also we need to look at advanced language competencies and to see how we are able to assist people to progress both professionally and also not have people trapped in low skill work only that maybe doesn't need a higher level of communicative ability. And then just the last slide is a happy slide. This is a group of students, Syrian students, who went through a language learning program supported by the Turkish presidency for Turks abroad, but they offer a scholarship program. So these were high school graduates who had graduated, who were Arabic speaking, but who graduated high school in Syria and had come to Turkey and wanted to continue their studies. And they went through a 10-month intensive language program that got them to the C1 level. And they were all very highly motivated because there was the offer of a scholarship after that, an ability to go to university. And these students had graduated, and many of them have gone on to also be informal supports within their community. And so really, this investment in language has really paid off. Some of these students, this is slightly old, some of the students are now graduating, are now working, have actually obtained Turkish citizenship through this and really built very strong social ties. So we see the success that can be achieved. So thank you very much. Great.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I was thinking if there are any questions from the audience or online, if you can see the chat, there is no question there. Then I have a question though. Okay. So we heard from Maciej before that there was there are kind of finite resources. So you can get education and then your social contacts are still finite resources, but media, you learn from a lot from media. You explained when you were in Canada and so on. Have you been looking from a refugee perspective on informal language learning using not only the education but also the social context, but also informal language learning with media? Is that something that you have looking at?
I think it hasn't been looked at in enough detail. I think there have been, I think with COVID, there has been a bigger focus on how to use distance and non-traditional means to learn languages. But I don't think we have much information on the extent to which it's been used.
Okay.
There have been language learning apps. There's one called Natakalam, which has been used as a way of also supporting refugee language learning. But I don't think it's been explored in the depth, and the potential hasn't been explored.
Yeah. I actually, the day before yesterday, I had a discussion with a mother who brought their young son, who was 3 years old, to Sweden and explained that he didn't accept the new language. But then she started to watch children TV programs with her son. And then over time, the language developed significantly, and the acceptance of the new language and how they could, with this SVT Språkkraft app that we have in Sweden, that you can actually see the translation of words. So his language in Spanish, in this case, developed in parallel to his new abilities in Swedish. So I hope that you can look into that in more depth in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Was there a hand?
Yeah, was there? Do you have a question? Or?
So this is perhaps a bit off topic because it's a bit more formal education, but I was curious, do you have like a repository where things are uploaded, where people can share maybe examples like were just mentioned, or learning materials for language learning?
So we have a UNHCR Education website. There are some materials, but more reports, not so much. The one repository we have is a program called Teaching About Refugees, which is also for teachers, for those who are having refugees enter their classes, but also how to speak about refugees and how to talk about the issue. But otherwise, very much we work more locally and working with through the inclusion in the national system, so trying to build on the kind of programs and initiatives that exist already in the country. But some of the good practices and the advocacy, those reports are on our website.
Thank you.